Right.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you for being back for this final session. You guys know that you're not only wrapping up and we're not only finishing the final session of this particular cohort tonight, but we're finishing the final session of what is the first of hopefully many Keller Center cohorts. This is I guess I'm kind of the guinea pig for this, because this is the first one that we've done. So hopefully there's going to be, a bunch of these from different leaders, and who knows, I may choose do a different one in the future, or maybe this one again for other people. But it means a lot that all of you have joined us, and so just thank you for taking the time. And I hope that the sessions so far have been helpful, and that as you're because you'll also have access to some of these videos that you may also be able to in the days and weeks ahead to be able to glean any insider information that is going to be helpful to you from the sessions. So we'll go ahead and jump right in to tonight, the fifth of the 5 challenges that we're looking that are facing the church in the Western world today. The way I would describe this one, and you've already seen the name of tonight's session, but we'll put it this way for challenge number 5: that we live in a world where people are moving apart, and technological advances propel people toward isolation, fragmentation, and polarization. I don't think it is all that difficult to notice that this is happening. I think it's pretty evident in our society today. Isolation, fragmentation, polarization, these are the realities that are confronting us and confronting the church. And a lot of times, these are problems that leave people feeling lonely, alienated from others. There's pain when people are rejected, and those feelings of loneliness, they can often push people towards self-protection. And that self-protection takes on the form of the retreating either into ourselves or into like cocoons of like-minded people, so either the cavern of yourself or in the cocoon of just people that think and exactly like you, and that can reinforce that cycle of polarization and isolation that led to some of those feelings in the first place. The danger of these kinds of cultural forces that lead to isolation is it reminds me of something that Bonhoeffer wrote in Life Together, a classic little book that I recommend. It's a little book, but it's packs a profound punch. He says that sin demands to have a man by himself. It withdraws him from the community. So Bonhoeffer saying, sin flourishes in isolation. So it's no wonder then that the evil one makes use of societal forces that are arrayed against true community, especially a community, that can stay unified despite significant differences, which would be the church. So obviously it's hard to be the church in this kind of world. Now, before we look at the ways the church can stand out and find some opportunities in this environment, because I am hopeful, I do think there are some, I want us to dig into a little bit of some of the reasons of why these developments have led to the situation that we find ourselves in. And let me just say, before we jump into these reasons that we're in this situation, let me just caveat this. There is so much changing on social media constantly, and not just social media, but our internet usage and the way that is affecting the church. And then so many things are happening politically and whatnot, that I feel like by the time books are coming out about some of these subjects, they're already out of date. Or not out of date, but already behind the curve as to how quickly culture is changing in some of these ways. So this I always leave this for number 5, because I'm thinking about these issues, and I'll have some things to add even to the notes that I've put together for here, just since I got these down, last fall. So just constantly having to think about what does it mean for us to live in the kind of age that we live in. So how did we get here? Well, one of the reasons is, I put it this way, is suspicion toward institutions. Our trust in institutions has plummeted. We live in a consumer society. We've been talking about this. We've got choice after choice. It's a technologically advanced age. There are all these opportunities to invent and reinvent ourselves online. And that leads to a lot of freedom, so to speak, but it's very disoriented. We make more choices. We have more choices than ever before, but we feel less confident about the choices that we made. So in the past, there was a buffer between the state and the individual, and that was provided through certain institutions. So the family, the neighborhood, the church, the union, the Rotary Club, groups like this provided a constraint on the sort of sorts, just a constraint on the types of choices that we might make. And we trusted these. Sometimes you'll hear people call them mediating institutions, but they're the in between the state and the individual, and they're the source of guidance that helps us navigate the choices that we confront. They put some paths forward for us. But today, we overtrust the self, and we view institutions with suspicion. And as these associations fall away, it's been decades now since the book came out from Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. That was bowling leagues, associations, things like that were a big deal. But as associations like that begin to fall away, and as these affinity groups disappear, and as mediating institutions weaken, well, then we're left with just the state and the lone individual. So no wonder every single political issue seems so contested and fraught with peril. I mean, if all that's there is you and the state, and all those institutions, those buffering things in between, are not really there as preservers of freedom, well, then we instinctively feel like everybody's individual liberty is at stake all the time. So we turn to lawmakers or the courts to ensure that, our pursuit of personal choice and however we conceive of individual freedom, that's going to continue without hindrance. Author, cultural commentator George Packer wrote a book a few years ago that explains how American society has undergone what he calls an unwinding. It's this process in which our individual freedom expands, but our community ties and institutions begin to unwind. So here's a quote from the book. He says, "The unwinding brings freedom more than the world has ever granted to more kinds of people than ever before. Freedom to go away, freedom to return, freedom to change your story, get your facts, get hired, get fired, get high, marry, divorce, go broke, begin again, start a business, have it both ways, take it to the limit, walk away from the ruins, succeed beyond your dreams and boast about it, fail abjectly and try again." And with freedom, the unwinding brings its illusions, for all these pursuits are as fragile as thought balloons popping against circumstances. Now, that's a lot of freedom right there, right? And on one sense, you would say, wow, it's wonderful that we live in a society where we're free to pursue all of these things. It sounds exhilarating, but there's a downside. This is what he says. He says, "This much freedom leaves you on your own. More Americans than ever before live alone, but even a family can exist in isolation, just managing to survive in the shadow of a huge military base without a soul to lend a hand. A shiny new community can spring up overnight miles from anywhere, then fade away just as fast. An old city can lose its industrial foundation and 2/3 of its people, while all its mainstays, churches, government, businesses, charities, unions, fall like building flats in a strong wind, hardly making a sound. Alone on a landscape without solid structures, Americans have to improvise their own destinies, plot their own stories of success and salvation." So hear what he's saying. So we call this freedom. It's a really narrow definition and understanding of freedom. And this way of life may be something we think we want, but we regret when we have it. So that's a takeaway from the unwinding. But another reason, though, that there's this distrust in institutions, why that's been on the rise, the distrust has been on the rise. It's explained by Yuval Levin in his book, A Time to Build. So this is an important book, I think. Levin makes the case that institutions, a lot of times Americans see them like institutions are like a necessary evil. He says, no, they're actually an indispensable good for a healthy society. And says much of our current malaise can be traced to the weakening of institutions in an era of individualism. We've got this anti-institutional bent that can lead us to be frustrated with institutional failure. But that frustration actually stems from a deeper feeling that we need institutions to be strong. So a lot of the vitriol toward institutions at times is because we feel like they're failing us, like they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, whether it be, Congress, or whether it be the church, or whether it be, Christian parachurch organizations, or whatever it might be. Levin believes that we have moved away from this is key here, from a formative understanding of institutions, meaning it used to be that if a leader was a leader of an institution, that they sort of held that in sacred trust, right? And he said it was formative in the sense that you would pour yourself into the mold of that structure. So if it's the state legislature, or the Senate, or if it's the academy, or the church, whatever it is, that's an institution, right? And you would pour yourself into that structure and sort of be shaped by that institution. He said we've moved away from that, where the institution forms us, restrains us, kind of constrains us. We moved away from that to something else altogether, which he says is a performative understanding, in which if you're a leader, you just use the institution as a platform. So we've moved from, and you can see this, I'll just use the example of government. You can see this with both like Republican and Democratic senators and representatives these days, where it's not so much, are you getting something done? Are you passing legislation? Are you proposing legislation? Are you trying to work to get something down the aisle? It's, are you, doing whatever are you doing TikTok, Instagram, making sure you're making it onto Fox News or MSNBC or whatever? Like, are you making the cable news run? Like, it's a performance. We've moved from formation to performance, from being molded into the institution to seeing the institution as a platform. So rather than the individual conforming to the constraints of the institution and acting for the good of the organization, the individual sees the institution as a platform, and that's where they build up themselves. So that's the example that he gives, and he gives some actual examples. I won't go into details here, but just contrasting elected officials from 40 years ago. You were to pass legislation, build consensus, and officials today who measure success not by their accomplishments legislatively, but how much they can become a news-making machine. And I think you can find those dynamics, that performance-driven use of institutions in the church and Christian organizations, and of course through social media. And that leads us to the next reason for polarization and isolation. So let's just go on to social media. That's one of the big elephants in the room. Internet connectivity and social media. So Levin talks about this as well. This shift from mold to platform in our institutional life has been exacerbated by social media. So here's something he says. He says, when future generations look back upon the early decades of the 21st century, they will surely wonder at the bizarre spectacle of our society driving itself mad on social media. He says, so the model of social media, he says, it involves the creation of a self-contained social space in which we can display or express ourselves before others and receive immediate reactions. See, that's why it's very powerful. So this formative power of a performative mindset, which is expected in a social media obsessed world where everyone's connected, that leads to the spread of celebrity culture, in which everybody's a celebrity. Everybody is thinking of themselves as living performatively. I mean, just think about just the nature of how much we all think now, those of us online a lot, think of ourselves as broadcasters. And I don't just mean like actual broadcasters or media personalities or writers or things like, I just mean everybody sees themselves that way. So if you wonder why it seems like so many divisions have become so stark so fast, and you're wondering what could be exacerbating these tensions, well, a lot of people say, well, it's social media. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's, Instagram, whatever it might be. And you'll see, there's documentaries and things out there about how the algorithms of these sites are designed to maximize and extend the time that we spend on the platform. So yeah, it's no wonder that they serve morsel after morsel of content that's just tailored to whatever grabs our interest. And especially the things that are going to grab your interest, well, it's whatever's divisive, right? The flames of division, whatever gets that reaction. It's not the reaction of joy and happiness that the social media algorithms are going for. They want you to feel disgust. And we'll get to that in a little more detail in a minute. But all that division gets flamed by social media. So I know you're hearing me. Maybe some of you have watched I think it's called the Social Network. or the I can't remember. There's a Netflix. Oh, The Social Dilemma. There's a Netflix documentary about all this. So it would be easy. It would be. It's too simple though for me to just say, okay. You might be saying, "Oh, right, Trevin. Yes. So algorithms are responsible, right?" Well, partly. It's not the whole story. The problem actually runs deeper than that. And here's why I'm saying that, because if you think that the big problem is a bad algorithm, then the solution is a better algorithm, right? An algorithm that's going to help you. You know, a lot of people are like, we just live in these ecosystems, in these silos, and we just live in separate worlds. We need an algorithm that's going to help us encounter opposing viewpoints more often. That sounds really good. That doesn't actually work, though. Duke University professor Chris Bale has a book called Breaking the Social Media Prism, and he points to research showing there's actually little evidence to support the idea that it's the algorithm primarily that makes people get radicalized online. And I know some of you may be thinking, yeah, but what about all those news headlines about troll farms and misinformation campaigns? And I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the examples of the Russian misinformation campaigns in some of the elections, but they're not really convincing. If you look at them, I highly doubt a ton of people were determined to vote one way or another because of one of these misinformation campaigns. I mean, there's little evidence actually that shows that this is a major source of political divisions. Even the mass media campaigns that are successful don't have the effects that we tend to think they do. And what's more, there's a book called The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef that goes against the grain of common sense wisdom. They actually did studies on this, and it showed that exposure to the other side politically doesn't make someone more inclined to a middle position or more likely to question their views. In fact, in many cases, a person tends to grow more polarized after having encountered the views of the other side if they already think their opponents are awful, and then they encounter some of the most awful of those opponents, then they think they're just even more awful than they could have even imagined. So the idea that, the way to get over this is just diversify your news sources and political commentators, you get the hardcore, MAGA Republican to go watch MSNBC for a month. They're going to feel more disgust for liberals generally, and vice versa. You get the hardcore, woke leftist, whatever, to go watch Fox News for a month. It doesn't work this way. And so you say, well, why doesn't it work? Well, Bale's work actually dives deeper to show us why just exposing yourself to other viewpoints online doesn't make you more reasonable. You can break out of the echo chamber, but that can actually be counterproductive. And he says the reason is because the problem, the algorithm can be a problem, but it goes deeper than that. It's a heart issue. And social media exacerbates the heart issue. It doesn't create it. So this is what Bale says. Look at this quote here. He says, in an era of growing social isolation, social media platforms have become one of the most important tools we are used to understand ourselves and each other. I think this is especially true post-pandemic, or during the pandemic. It became even more true for many people. Social media helps us do something we humans are hardwired to do: present different versions of ourselves, observe what other people think of them, and revise our identities accordingly. Here's the takeaway from that. We are not testing ideas on social media. We are trying on identities. That's really key. And what's the result of that? Well, here Bale goes on. He says, social media is more like a prism that refracts our identities, leaving us with a distorted understanding of each other and ourselves. The social media prism fuels status-seeking extremists, mutes moderates who think there is little to be gained by discussing politics on social media. That's an interesting fact. We'll come back to that. And leaves most of us with profound misgivings about those on the other side and even the scope of polarization itself. So get what he's saying here. Once we invest ourselves in creating an identity online, we are, and think about especially young people who are working out what they think, what they believe, how they see themselves. Okay, so just put yourselves in the shoes of someone who's in their 20s today or in their teens. So once we create that identity online, we are primed and ready to take offense when someone disagrees with us or when someone articulates a viewpoint that we think is profoundly mistaken. and see, so when someone, so you say, well, you need to get out of your little echo chamber. Okay. For a lot of people though, that it's not just a way of seeking out different ideas. When you step out of your echo chamber, that's like going into enemy territory, and you're inviting someone to attack your very identity. Okay. So I think these developments affect the church and how Christians behave online as well. Because remember, what Bale is saying is social media is not really an arena for ideas to compete. I mean, how many people are convinced by arguments on a Facebook comment thread? Generally. I mean, let's just be real here. Social media is not really an arena for ideas to compete. It's a place for vicious competition between identities. So Bale says this, he says, the deeper source of our addiction to social media is that it makes it so much easier for us to do what is all too human: perform different identities, observe how other people react, and update our presentation of self to make us feel like we belong. The great tragedy of social media is that it makes our tendency to misread our social environment even worse. And so that's what happened. All these online incentives lead to increasing polarization. And it happens especially in the realm of politics. Chris Bale says that political extremists get pushed and pulled toward radical positions because of the people that like their posts and the new follows they get and the other types of engagement. All the incentives are to keep going further and further. And if they start to show sympathy toward the mainstream or toward the people on the other side of the aisle or something, well, then they are afraid of the retribution that will come at them online. And so what the social media prism actually does is it makes people from the opposing side seem more extreme than they are. It normalizes the extremism on your side, and it exaggerates the extremism on the other side. And this explains why, and you may have seen this happen. Strangely enough, sometimes it's those who are adjacent to a certain perspective. Like they're not quite in line with you, but they're just like right next door. They sometimes get the biggest criticism. Bale calls it a purification ritual because they're attacking those on the periphery of their own side. They're seen as the traitors. A few years ago, Kevin Dundalk was writing in Comment magazine, and he talked about how we're seeing some of the markers of political identity can help us know what we are not, but usually don't give us confidence in who we are. So in this whole thing we're talking about here, this isolation, fragmentation, polarization, all of that, it leads us to create a self-understanding that is based in opposition toward others. So it's not that you have a vision for what you are and what you want to accomplish. It's that you have an anti-vision, a negative view of, well, we are not that. So not a positive understanding of this is what we stand for, but I just know I'm not that. So in Comment a few years ago, when he was writing about this, he said he said when you're talking about people, how they're marked in political identity into tribes or whatnot, the question is not whether someone is one of us, but whether he was one of them. Right? That sort of negative polarization. And social networks work in the same way. The out group helps us define the in group. So he says, in terms of how groups shape identity, we are not only or even primarily what we love, we are also defined by what we distrust or who we feel disgust toward or who we can't stand. And this is why, if you put all this together, okay, this is why it's increasingly rare these days to hear someone say something like this. Hey, I think this thinker does great work here and here, but I disagree on that particular issue over there. I really like this person on this subject. I think they're off on this other topic, but I like them here. Okay, so why don't we hear that as much? Well, as soon as you start expressing that disagreement, the fans of the leader that you're critiquing is going to just write you off and say, well, you must be just one of the other haters out there, And the people that oppose that leader, if they hear you saying something nice about something that they think, or these kind words, then they're just going to say, well, you're just a weakling, you're just a compromiser. Like, how could you, no matter what tribe you're in, you have to demonstrate fealty, right? Everything is all or nothing. Reject that brother, no matter what. Embrace that sister, no matter what. It's, prove your purity. That's the world that we live in. I'm sure a lot of these dynamics are familiar to some of you who see these conversations. And then you see how the conversations actually wind up in the church. Some of that stuff that happens online does eventually filter its way into the church. So what opportunities do we have as believers in this kind of environment? Well, rightly understood, the church itself can be a countersign, can be a counterpoint to this way of life. I'm reminded again of Leslie Newbigin, the missionary theologian, and him talking about how the church, remember, is the hermeneutic of the gospel, right? It's the way of demonstrating through our common life together the truths that we proclaim about Jesus, the King of the world. So let's shift over to opportunities now. This is the big opportunity here. Churches can bring together individuals from different classes, ethnicities, and political persuasions and forge a renewed form of solidarity and unity around the gospel. That's the opportunity. Nothing else, nothing in our society is seeking to do this. The church could be different, could stand out here. That's an opportunity to do something that seems like it's impossible apart from a miracle. We are the miracle kind of people. We have this opportunity. So what would the steps be like for us to do that? Well, I've got a few steps on here. The first would just be gathering together. I don't think we're going to make progress until we regain a commitment and a passion for gathering together. And I mean physically, not as digital avatars. And I know I'm saying that at a Keller Center cohort in which for the last 5 weeks, we've gathered digitally. But we're not the church, are we? Right? We're not doing Lord's Supper. We're not doing baptisms here. We are, people from the universal church that belong to hopefully all of us local churches, but we're coming together and we're having a session like this. And I'm saying for the church in particular, coming together in person really does matter. Jay Kim has the book Analog Church, Why We Need Real People, Places, and Things in a Digital Age. Really good book. But he talks about the inadequacies of technology when it comes to discipleship in a digital era. And he really pushes back against this notion that you can sustain a community of faith just by simply delivering sermons or songs online. And he even says, let's watch our language here. We don't want to confuse the language of community with the language of commodity. So this is what he writes. He says, an online church is more a product to be consumed than it is a people to be joined. Community isn't about getting a product out there, but about gathering people wherever they are. So many of our churches continue to push into online spaces and call it community and connection. And look, I think that it was great that during the pandemic we were able to stream services. I think there's a sense in which those shelter at home orders. It forced us all to live at the extreme end of a trajectory that was already becoming true of our society, that we would just be sort of isolated as families or as individuals. But if you look, in recent years, even before the pandemic and especially now after, people are self-isolating more and more, just content with, the devices that just keep us constantly distracted. And look, there are certain values that come along with the digital age that we need to really think about their formation on our heart. Kim talks about speed, choices, individualism. He says the speed of the digital age has made us impatient. The choices of the digital age have made us shallow. The individualism of the digital age has made us isolated. And his point is, our technological tools are not neutral. They shape our expectations. There's a formative influence on the kind of people we are becoming. Felicia Wusong makes a similar case. She talks about we need counter liturgies because we've got particular habits, liturgies, whatnot, that come from these devices. And it's not so much about the management of time, it's the management of our attention. And she talks about how embodiment matters as well. The physicality of our togetherness is precious. And she actually offers a sample list of 10 habits or commitments to ordered digital life, is what she says. And she models them after Martin Luther King's commitment cards for his volunteers, basically. Here's an example of a commitment card, like where you're kind of like, you're committing to be something. She says, one example, when I am sad, bored, angry, lonely, or anxious, reach for another person, nature, or God before turning to a screen. Like, if this is how I feel, this is my response. I either go outside, I call someone, I go to God in prayer, whatever it might be. But when I feel this way, I don't reach for a phone or a laptop or, another Netflix documentary. Just think about how transformational that simple practice would be if all Christians everywhere said, this is what we're going to do in this particular moment. So it's interesting. I do think, because we did all experience a technology only kind of church for some weeks or months. I mean, I don't know, the mandates and restrictions were different in different places. In some cases, churches were out even more than a year. I think we should be aware, though, of the drawbacks of digital connection. Digital technologies at their best, they're a supplement, but they are not a replacement for true connection. And we as God's people, embody, we break bread together, we drink of the common cup. Like, we can't lose sight of the real thing. And I hope that churches that have been put in that strange place of being forbidden to gather for a season, I'm hoping that we will find a renewed enthusiasm for being in person with God's people in the future. The author of Hebrews, not for nothing, does the author of Hebrews remind us to not neglect gathering together, and all the more as the day of the Lord draws closer. This is vital to Christianity. So gathering together face to face. I'm working on a column for the Gospel Coalition about heading into election season 2024, and I'm just urging pastors and church leaders to prioritize the needs of very in-person people rather than the preferences or the passions of very online people, because I think it's easy to get distorted and not actually be looking at the saints in front of us that are actually with us in community. Okay, so that's a first way of sort of implementing that opportunity. A second one is what I call the adoption of subversive spiritual disciplines. I think we talked about this in one of the previous sessions briefly, and I just want to go into a little more detail on it. These are what I mean by subversive spiritual disciplines. I'm talking about everyday habits and practices that either increase that are meant to increase the position of the scriptural story in our hearts. So here's the question I think we got to ask. What practices or habits would have the effect of lifting up the grand narrative of Scripture, the scriptural story, while also, and here's the subversive aspect, demoting lesser stories that could capture our hearts? So that's the question. You want to live according to the story as it's laid out in Scripture. How do you do that? How do your practices help you do that and counter the false narratives, the lesser stories that wind up sometimes affecting our choices? There's a good start in imagining what this might look like in Justin Whitmel Early's book called The Common Rule. He talks about how we have a common problem. We ignore the ways that habits shape us. And because of that, we've assimilated to a hidden rule of life, which is the sort of the American rule of life. And so we wind up getting formed just like everybody else into all the same anxiety, depression, consumerism, injustice, vanity that's just kind of typical to a lot of people. What Justin is saying is we need a set of counter-formative practices so that we can be formed into people who really love God and love our neighbors. And that's what we were created to be. So Justin's book combines, a general and a subversive approach. His recommendations are general. He's saying they're for everybody, but his goal is subversive because he's trying to counteract those lesser stories. He actually calls them resistance, counterformative practices. So how do we get started in adopting or recommending subversive habits? And I'll give you an example. This is the most important step. It would be to help people identify the primary story that they're living by. And we need a diagnostic so we can see what is the lesser story that may be displacing the scriptural story. I have a column on this. If you want to look it up, we can put it in the notes that Mike will send out. That'll help you kind of do a diagnostic. But let me just give you an example, since we've talked a lot about polarization and politics and things. Let me give you an example of a church-going woman. Let's call her Pamela. Okay. The primary story that gives shape and direction to Pamela's life is the wins and losses of the political party she belongs to. Okay. So if she were to write the story of her life right now, like what's taking up her time and attention, it would tell of her involvement in the saga of whatever is happening politically. So this is the sort of the story she sees herself in. It's a political narrative. You've got politicians and pundits, and they're duking it out over the future of the country. That's the story she sees herself in. And it unfolds as this mesmerizing drama that is chronicled daily through social media, newscasts, whatever. So Pam sees herself as a foot soldier in a war in which people on one side want to destroy the nation, people on her side are fighting valiantly to protect it. And she can watch videos, all the time of some of her favorite personalities owning or destroying or shutting people down on the other side of the aisle. She cheers, she campaigns, she leaves comments, she shares articles, and her setbacks and steps forward are connected not to her growth in Christ-likeness. The way she sees setbacks and steps forward, that's connected to election results, recent polls, debate performances, how her campaigner, how her candidate's doing, things like that. Now, here's the thing. Pam is religious. She tries to read a chapter from the Bible every day. She goes to church every week. But for the most part, her attention is consumed by politics. I mean, the story of her day is determined by whatever the news, cable news networks are saying is breaking news. The dominant narrative, she's religious, but the dominant narrative of her life is summed up in political involvement. She thinks about that when she wakes up, before she goes to bed. Her church going, she reads the Bible. That's great, but that just reinforces her sense that she's fighting the good fight. Okay. So, basically the narrative of Pam's life closely follows the latest drama from government and politics. She may read her Bible and she goes to church. Those are general spiritual habits, really good. But I think she also needs subversive specific habits. And here's what I mean by subversive spiritual disciplines. I'm saying it's not enough that she's just going to go to church and she may read a couple of Bible verses a day. In order to keep that lesser story, politics, which is important, but again, a lesser story, from gaining the dominance in her life. Well, one of the things she could do, she could observe the scripture before phone rule every morning, scripture before phone. And she realizes, at some point she's like, I'm reading a verse or two a day for inspiration is not going to counter the magnetic pull of all the political commentary that ignites her imagination. So she commits. She's like, I'm going to spend half an hour in Bible reading and prayer at the start of every day. And I'm going to keep my phone in another room in the house, not next to my bed, so that, basically Pam's saying, I'm insistent. I'm going to begin my day with scripture, not with scrolling. Okay. So that's an example of a subversive spiritualism. It's not just I'm going to read my Bible every day. I'm going to read my Bible, but also connect it to something that is intending to demote this other thing that would capture my imagination. Another subversive spiritual discipline she could do. She could limit her exposure to social media accounts and political websites because, on your phone, you can actually have your phone. You can do this in screen time. You can have it alert you when you've spent more than a certain amount of time scrolling and commenting on something. So if you're on this app or that app or social media in general, you could say, look, I don't want to do more than an hour a day on this. Or I'm not going to do more than 30 minutes a day on this. And you set the timer. When it goes off, it's off. You're done. Just to kind of put some brakes on that, some constraints. Okay. So that's another example. Another subversive spiritual discipline. This one's tricky. Let's say Pam purposefully fills her prayer list with popular politicians from both parties, including the ones that she's tempted to despise. Because let me just tell you, it's hard to hate someone you pray for regularly. And let's say she also prays for people in her congregation who she knows are not on the same page with her politically. This reminds me of a Bonhoeffer quote. It says, a Christian fellowship lives and exists by the intercession of its members for one another, or it collapses. I can no longer condemn or hate a brother for whom I pray, no matter how much trouble he causes me. His face, that hitherto may have been strange and intolerable to me, is transformed in intercession into the countenance of a brother for whom Christ died, the face of a forgiven sinner. Love that quote. So that again, another example of a subversive spiritual discipline. Here's another. She could make a commitment that twice a month she's going to share a meal with Christians who have different political perspectives, just to sort of give her more perspective on some of these things. Here's another one she could do. She could, just to sort of get out of the bubble of her own nation's politics, she could have like a book like Operation World. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it basically takes you through different countries. And it will tell you the state of evangelical Christianity in those countries, the population, some of the challenges Christians face, and whatnot. You could basically pray through the countries listed in Operation World, or, she could be subscribed to like Voice of the Martyrs or whatever, just to be aware of missionary needs in other parts of the world that remind her of Christian faithfulness in other parts of the world. Do you see how all these fit together? So slowly but surely, by adopting these new habits and practices that are deliberately designed to subvert the lesser story of politics, Pam, she'll still be involved in politics, but she sees her life more in terms of the scriptural story, and that should give her life more meaning and significance. That's got to be the bigger story. Now, there are other examples we could give depending on what needs to be subverted. I've on my column before at Gospel Coalition, I've talked a little bit about people who sort of live for leisure, or people who live for their career. Their career is really their story, or whatnot. But I've used the example, of a pastor who parked far from the sanctuary, so that instead of having a short path to the church building, having to walk across the whole parking lot on Sunday mornings, in order to guard against the mindset that if it's all about him, like to remind himself that he's there to serve other people, that others come first. These are the kinds of subversive spiritual disciplines that we've got to think about. And don't misunderstand me. It's not a thus says the Lord from scripture. None of this is. It's not an example of right or wrong. It's you're looking for habits that subvert that lesser story that could become primary in your heart, in your affections. Since we've talked about him several times, I'll go back to C.S. Lewis. For years, people who were close to C.S. Lewis, they shook their heads in consternation that this habit he had of answering all these letters that crossed his desk. You can actually find letters with like his brother and other people saying how many books Lewis would have written if he had just put aside those interminable interruptions and focused on his work. Like, why was he answering letters to random people from all over the world? Now, listen, I don't think every writer or thinker is called to answer every letter in the way Lewis did. There's no divine command when it comes to well-known Christians answering letters. But I think for Lewis, this was an example of a subversive habit. If you look at his early letters before he was converted, they're just full of snobbery. The guy was like he's boastful, haughty. There's a condescension. You contrast those early letters with the letters that come later in life. And there you see a man that when he's asked about spiritual matters, takes time to respond to individuals with words of spiritual insight and devotion and patience. And he devoted a lot of time basically placing himself in the role of a servant to his readers. And by answering their questions, he allowed them to set the agenda for much of his writing. And that discipline also subverted the instinct that he had to call the shots. Now we know the end of the story there. We got like 3 volumes of Lewis's letters, and they're like famous, and like there's some rich spiritual counsel and insight in a lot of those letters, and that we all get to benefit from them. But that's not what the plan was. That's not how it started. It was just him basically putting himself on a rung lower than his readers to go through that. So I think over time, that's one of the things that helped make Lewis was the fact that he didn't see these people as interruptions. He saw them as divine appointments. So these general spiritual disciplines, prayer, Bible reading, church attendance, All of that is essential. Don't hear me saying we should go against those habits. All I'm saying is those habits, I think in our day and age, they're going to need an edge. And we're going to need to incorporate into our general spiritual disciplines this some kind of counterformative element. We got to get creative here, help people think through what it might be. I mean, for prayer, then, maybe the discipline isn't, I'm just going a few minutes of hurried prayer in the morning, but I'm going to punctuate the day with regular times of prayer through the Psalms. I'm just going to make sure I'm turning my mind to the Lord in the midst of busyness, whatever it might be. We've got to think about some ways. Okay. One last aspect here on this is that we've got to regain a sense of wonder at the reality of justification. We've got to go back to one of the beautiful aspects of the gospel. Changing the algorithm won't fix the problems. We need hearts to be changed in the church. And I don't think that's going to happen apart from an internal sense of security that comes through justification by faith. Now you may be like, Trevor, what does justification by faith have to do with what we've been talking about? Online tribal warfare, like what? Well, remember, the gospel announces the gift of God's grace based on Christ's person and his work in our place. We rest assured in him. He is the source of our identity. He is our victory. And once you know that you're accepted by God because of Christ's performance, not ours, when we know that deep down in our souls and our heart of our beings, then we don't interpret online disagreement, even harsh words. It can't completely attack our identity. And when we speak the truth and when we defend the faith or we correct someone in error, we don't do that because we're trying to prove our loyalty to this tribe or that tribe, or we're trying to, crush someone or smack down our opponent. No, whenever we are gently correcting, we're doing so out of a sincere concern for someone else. And we got the humility knowing we're probably not getting everything right either. So I'm just saying, with that, we need that heartfelt understanding of justification by faith so that we can avoid following the world's tribal impulses. We can avoid assuming the worst about our brothers and sisters in Christ. We can avoid catastrophizing every controversy online, proving our faithfulness to whatever camp we care most about. So 3, just initial thoughts about that opportunity. Now we're going to wrap up our time here, and then we'll have Q&A, but I want to kind of wrap up all 5 sessions here for just a moment. Sometimes when we're confronted with challenges like the ones we've been looking at, it would be easy, I think, for people to, scour the books of church history looking for, what was the pinnacle of the best times? What are the golden era? What's the era that we've fallen from that we've got to get back to? Depending on the group, you're going to find different people to answer that. Some people, it's the early church. Some people, it's the golden age of the ecumenical creeds. For some people, it's the Reformation, the Puritan era, if we could just get back to that. Other people, it's the revivals of North America, At whatever point we pick in time, we can contrast ourselves to our ancestors and feel like we've fallen from those heights. The world and the church is just getting worse every day. I say all that is a myth. And that's not because I'm saying everything's getting better, like everything's just consistently improving. I don't think that the disease of decline means you put the medicine of progress, or that the solution for pessimism is optimism or something like that. I love this quote from G.K. Chesterton. He was taking on the myth of progress a century ago. And he said, for the first 40 years of my life, practically no one in the world, and certainly no one of the world, had any doubt whatever about the way the world was going. He puts that in quotes, the way the world was going. And I mean, if you look back at his time, most people thought the world was moving toward democracy, human rights, greater freedom. The dark ages were behind, the feuding families and pillaging peoples and all that, all behind. Technology and science is ushering us into a new day. And these bloody battles of the past, that's going to become a distant memory. But then came fascism, Nazism, communism. And Chesterton said, well, what a man knows now is that the whole march of mankind can turn and tramp backwards in its tracks. that progress can start progressing or feeling as if it were progressing in precisely the contrary course from that which has been called progress for centuries. And so he's watching these events unfold in the 1930s, in the twilight years of his life. And he said that myth of progress it's not only wrong, it's dangerous. He says we shouldn't think of the world going in this upward direction of unending progress. He says this. He says the world is what the saints and prophets saw it was. It is not merely getting better or merely getting worse. There is one thing that the world does. It wobbles. It's one of my favorite quotes from Chesterton, and that's one of my favorite pictures of Chesterton. There in the modern world with the cars buzzing by with his hair in the wind, flopping his hair around, and he's just engrossed in some kind of book like he always was. But I think Chesterton was right. And that's why we need gospel bearings. We need the gospel to help us keep our footing when the world starts wobbling. We are not sliding down a hill into an abyss. Neither are we climbing up a ladder into the heavens. The world is right now what it has always been. It's the place where the powers and principalities array themselves against the living God. And it's the place where Jesus promises to return and reign. So it's a battlefield, yes. But it's a battlefield where the most hopeless situation of all time, I mean, the killing of our king, has been transformed into the most hopeful moment of eternity. New creation spilling out of the darkest tomb. I mean, we're going to celebrate that, we're just weeks away from that celebration. So, I mean, just think for a moment, if the cross, which is Rome's twisted symbol of domination, if that can become the source of hope and light for the world, well, then how can we possibly believe in this myth of unalterable decline, inevitable decline? If God can transform the cross into a symbol of hope, well, then don't you think he can take the difficulties of our present moment and even these 5 challenges we've been facing, and don't you think he can bring everlasting fruit for future generations? I mean, aren't we to believe that? So gospel bearings means that we don't fall for this fabled myth of progress, like we're, this evolutionary journey into some sort of secular utopia, but we don't fall for the myth of decline, as if only now we're discovering these new depths of evil and injustice. Look, there's a lot to be upset about, a lot to be angry about, a lot to be concerned about in our society. But I would just say, do a study of the Roman Empire. Or some of the church abuses of different eras of our country. The idea that just now we've arrived at a new stage of depravity in the world, you got to have more historical perspective than that. We've got to do the work to lift our heads from this current moment and to listen to the words of the psalmist, to hear the lament of the prophets, to recall the stories of our ancestors, to visit our church fathers, to read and to learn from our missionary mothers, and just to realize, look, spiritual struggle is the norm, not the exception. Yeah, the world is shaking, but it's not shaking because of terrible evil, but the greatest good. The gospel of a crucified and risen king continues to transform hearts and lives. And it's the shockwave from the resurrection that is still rippling out into the world 2,000 years later. So once again, I'll finish by quoting Leslie Newbigin. He was asked once whether he was optimistic or pessimistic. And he said, I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. That's ultimately our hope, and that's where we put our trust and our faith. So, Skylar, I'll turn it back over to you if you want to kill the presentation there, and we can have some conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Trevin. I'll start off with a really easy one for you, and it's we just have to ask Trevin, is this your lucky cohort shirt? And then they wanted to make sure and thank you for a great class.
Okay, I was wondering if anyone was going to notice that I wore the same shirt every single Thursday night. And the reason I did that is because it's the perfect shirt for this season, which I love March, because when we started this cohort, it was still cold and really dark. but now it's like warmed up, like it's actually warm in the office, the room that I'm doing this in, and it just got dark, right as we were getting started, rather than a ways before. So yeah, for me anyway. I know some of you guys that you're on different time zones, but no, I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to stick with the same one every time. I mean, if I don't have any place to go, I go to Subway every day for lunch. I try to save my decision making for stuff that matters more, and then just leave the other stuff to where I don't have to think about it. And that's an example of my strategy. So yeah.
It's a subversive spiritual discipline, some might say,
Yeah.
and I applaud you for it. No, okay. Well, we have a couple of shorter questions, and then I think it'll open up to some longer ones. All of them really good. But just to start off, you mentioned that you have a subversive spiritual discipline of Bible before phone in the morning. Can you just give us some other examples, some other ways that you've seen maybe in your own life or modeled by others or heard commended from others um, of subversive spiritual disciplines?
Yeah. I'm tempted to just look up like a column that I wrote a few years ago to see what I wrote down there, because I had a bunch for different, but it's the way that you get them to be subversive is that you're actually looking to see what is the lesser story that you're trying to counteract, right? So like it's not real. That's why they got to be personalized. Like it just can't be, oh, let's take to our church, everybody's going to do this one. Now, I think the Bible before phone one would be good for everybody. I mean, again, not legalistically, I'm saying, but like I have an old alarm clock, like an old timey alarm clock that I use for that particular reason, because I'm just like I don't want the phone in the bedroom. I want to go to my Bible first thing. Something that has become better for me, that has become more common for me, is I do use the 3 times a day prayer of the Psalms in 30 days. So I don't know if we've mentioned this in this cohort or not, but you can find this online if you're interested in it. But it's an ancient practice of going through all the Psalms in 30 days. Generally, in like you can find it in certain prayer books. It's generally morning and evening. But what I do is a morning, midday, and evening, and it's kind of a prayer journey. So it's structured like there's a confession of faith in the morning, a confession of sin in the evening, and it's prayers of the church and whatnot. So, and I'm working right now. There's one, we're doing a life of Jesus in 30 days as well. So you pray through the life of Jesus in 30 days. And I've got the sample. Oh, I put it upstairs, but I have the sample. I'm working on letters of Paul next. So this is just a way of like, how can I pray through important sections of scripture in a way that is structured? Because I need structure, and I've got a slot there for, once you pray, it does follow the Didache's recommendation, which is the old ancient, like one of the oldest Christian manuscripts outside of the New Testament, where Christians were praying the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. It does follow that as well. But I do have a section that's intercessions and personal requests, where you can do something spontaneous. And where basically that's where I do all of my personal requests. But having that structure, and you can do it in, generally 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening, maybe 5 minutes in the midday. It's not as long. If you do that, you're spending basically right there 25 minutes a day in prayer, just by splitting it up kind of that way. So some of the ways that we tend to think about prayer of like, oh, I got to be like these great saints who like prayed for an hour in the morning, or that I like, no, there's ways that we can, incorporate this into our lives. So that's been a subversive spiritual discipline, in that it has deliberately kept me punctuating my day with prayer. And it's also one of the things that it works on me on is that it makes me not just pray what I feel, but sometimes pray alongside other people what they may be feeling. So, for example, if I'm in a moment where I'm not necessarily feeling like I'm going through a real struggle, and I'm not feeling really happy and joyful in the Lord, sometimes I come across a psalm and it's like, that's what you're praying. You're like moving your heart in line with that, whether you feel it or not. And other times things are going great, and you get them across a lament song, and it's a calibration of the heart the other way, thinking about people in the who may be facing trials, or persecuted Christians that may be facing challenges and stuff like that. So that's been helpful for me too. But yeah, the scripture before phone one I think could be good for all of us. And then the time limits on phones and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Trevin. Second question: do you have a resource for helping people to identify what the lesser story they're believing in is? Whether that be a way that you steer conversations, a way that you try to, like when you're talking with people, work in this way. But what are some resources that you might have for helping people to identify those lesser stories you were talking about?
Yes. I am. So I have, I'm going to put I will put this in the chat. This is the series that I was talking about. I think I can put this in the chat, right? Everyone can see this? Okay.
Yep, everyone can see it.
So that should show that will take you to the whole series. And there's one of them in there in particular called the let's see which one it is. The identifying your primary story is the one I think is the one I'm looking for. But yeah, the diagnostic questions. I'll throw that one in there too, just so you got the shortcut to it. Basically, a few diagnostic questions if you're counseling people. So these are the ones I've put here. Number one, if someone close to you were to ask you to take 10 minutes to talk about the last 10 years of your life, how would you tell your story? Just ask that question to see where your mind runs first. Like, what's the drama that takes up most of the narrative? The second question is, in telling your story, what constitutes a step forward or a step back or a setback? So for example, like this helps you see the plot points. If it's, for example, if your story is the career, then the plot points are, well, this is my career has been moving forward. Like, this is the story of my life, and it's the story of my career, right? In moments of quiet, number three, in moments of quiet, where does your mind typically run to first? This just helps you see what's captured your imagination, your heart. Then there's a question about hopes and fears for the next 10 years, because this will illuminate the dramatic tension you sense, the unsettledness as you're like, what chapters are you expecting to be written, or you are afraid might be written in the next 10 years? What group of people is most important to you in fulfilling those hopes and fears? That helps you understand, like, where do I feel the biggest sense of community? Is it with with people online that share similar political views, or is it people at my job that are at the same place in the process? Is it people that I do hobbies with? Is it my church? You know what I mean? And then finally, what do I value most in life? And what is the difference between what I say I value and the way I spend my time? Those are, yeah, you might come up with better ones than that. And if you do, send them to me. I'm just thinking through, like, how do we help people, like, really take stock and do some self-assessment of, like, where they are in life. And I mean, I think these are questions that, like, I wrestle with these questions. These aren't questions, like, they're not gotcha questions for other people. I hope that everyone in here will be thinking about, gosh, how would I answer some of those questions? Because I mean, I think they could lead to some revealing areas where we may need to do some work in counterformative practices.
Awesome. Thanks for sending those links, and we'll make sure and get those in the recap email for everyone, so that y'all have those easily. To what extent are these issues the result of the church/pastors and teachers not bringing the scriptures to bear upon the culture challenges we're facing? In other words, they're not talking about the conversations we're having in this cohort. They're not connecting the scriptures with where people live in our culture. Yeah, so the question originally is, to what extent are all the issues we're seeing, the challenges that you've mentioned over these last few days, just the result of the church just not talking about them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't. I typically think there's aspects of some of our cultural challenges that you could lay at the feet of the church and say that, we haven't been salt and light as we should, maybe in particular spheres, or we haven't talked, we haven't preached enough about this subject or that subject, or been as strong. There's been a sense in this has been one of the challenges in some of the seeker sensitive, some of the church growth movement has been, let's just focus on what's immediately practical, and what tends to sort of just make for a better Monday kind of a thing, to kind of keep people in the door, like they're get what, and you can kind of downplay doctrine over time if you do that, and or lose out on some of the things that could be more offensive in Christianity. So there's been that's been a big dose in a lot of preaching, I think, of that that we've kind of got to push back against. But I'm typically one, I'm not going to be one to like lay the blame at the foot of the church there, because a lot of these cultural challenges we're facing are centuries in development. Like if you read Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, or Strange New World, like, I mean, he's tracing we're talking about back to the 1800s, and into the Romantic movement and whatnot. So a lot of what we're facing today is the end of an era that has been building for a long time, and the church has been in some ways slowing down some of that, in other ways maybe even aiding it. It's really complicated and messy. So I do think, though, that one of the best ways to be relevant in preaching and teaching today is to preach with an edge. And I don't mean to try to be offensive. I mean, preach the passage or the text of Scripture, and ask the question, how does this counter what so many people in our society think, the way they think? I just think that's vitally important. And I don't just mean, I'm not saying, how does this passage of Scripture lead us to think this way about, this interaction online or this particular cultural moment or whatnot. I'm asking the question more of back to the expressive individualism and that kind of stuff. Like asking that, like, where's the edge in showing that? And I mean, we've talked about this in previous weeks, it's a thing I think would be good for pastors and seminary to have sort of added to their homiletics class, their preaching prep classes. Like, okay, that was a good exposition of this text. How does it counter what common sense is in the world today? Like, or how can you, just give it a little bit of that counter cultural element to it? I think that will make preaching seem immediately more practical and relevant, no matter what it is we're preaching on.
Absolutely. Another question about worship and pastoring. I've been reflecting on corporate worship and modern worship music as potential sources of distraction. It's not the style of music that concerns me, but rather the way we approach singing together. Sometimes our worship can become overly performative, expressive, and individualistic, which can take the focus away from God. So, what kind of subversive spiritual discipline could we adopt to keep God at the center of our singing and give Him the worth? So, thinking of subversive spiritual disciplines, but also think of them corporately.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, worship can wind up getting sucked into everything else that we've been talking about, where it becomes something that we do because of how we are seeking to sort of fulfill ourselves, right? Or like feel something. And when that happens, it can become a distraction from actual worship of God, because we're pursuing something, that we're pursuing a kind of feeling or emotion, or we're worshiping corporately in a way because we want other people to see us. Like I do feel this sometimes, like especially because we've got cameras and screens now and all sorts of stuff. It's just hard for worship to not be performative at some level these days. And so it can be really tricky. I mean, we're a far cry today from, there are other church traditions where the choir sings in the balcony in the back of the church and no one even sees them. And like only the pastor's in the front or the priest or whatever. And like you hear, it's like almost like angel voices. They're behind, but no one even sees the singers. I wonder like what it would be like if we like flipped things, in that kind of way, where there was music, but you didn't actually see performance. some worship leaders I know would push back and say, but people that are leading in worship are actually helping people know how to express themselves and how to think through. But here's the thing, worship is not primarily about self-expression. It's about expression of the glory of God. It's a giving back to God and him giving to us in worship. It's not about the feeling we receive. If we receive it, it's wonderful, but that's not why we're there. We're there because he commands it and because we're reorienting our lives and our hearts to that. So subversive spiritual disciplines, I mean, you could completely go quiet. I mean, you can change up the style so that people are a little bit they're not always sure what they're going to get. You could have this someone on a piano and take away screens at some point here and there. I remember, one of the best worship songs from the 90s that's still sung a lot today is Matt Redman's The Heart of Worship, because it was basically that kind of a song, right? It's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. When all is stripped away and there's no more, you take away the music or the lights or whatever it is. And it's just at the end of the day, it all comes back to Jesus. So I think we got to get creative there. I think you guys may have better ideas, like what does that look like, and corporately, not just individualistically. But I think it's a great question.
Yeah, and I'm gonna continue off of that one with a question that just came in, because the concepts that you mentioned during your discussion of the online versus the analog church, they're interesting. But today there's so many large churches and churches with celebrity pastors, and it says analog churches are also part of the fragmentation problems, and the congregation is worshiping in isolation slash performative. So kind of some of the many ideas that we were just talking about. And so, yeah, they were just asking if you do have any ideas or solutions, when the reality is that even if we're pushing back and saying we're not going to do this, that can kind of get lost in the sea of so many churches that are.
Yeah. This is a really tough one. There's an online debate about this, even like, is it wise to keep live streaming all of our services or keeping them up, for all the time? I think there's a lot of challenges with the live streams. One of the columns I got the most flack for last year that I wrote was about gotcha sermon clips, because I was seeing it happen with sort of like independent fundamentalist Baptist kind of, sermon clips were being, little clips being out and making the rounds that everyone was like mocking or saying were terrible or whatnot. Some of them really were bad. But then I was also saying like the same thing, oh, look at this person or this, the terrible exegesis on this or whatnot. And I was just saying, gosh, I just don't know that ultimately this is one of the things that 25 years ago wouldn't have even been possible. It's partly because everything's live streamed now. So all of the sloppy preaching in America is now live streamed and available online. And I'm like, is preaching sloppier today? Or has preaching always, has there always just been kind of, the Spirit speaking through the pastor who's muddling through the text, sometimes not always doing it great, may not even be trained theologically, or even if he's trained, may not actually be interesting. I don't know. But there are all these different dynamics that we're thinking about today that we didn't even have to think about a couple of decades ago. So how do we roll that back? There are some people that are saying we should stop podcasting sermons, stop putting live stream on. But then there are so many churches that are not going to stop. Then you wonder, well, are we limiting our reach in some way if we don't continue to do this? I will say one of the big challenges that one of the things that is good for a smaller church, that I think is a benefit of a smaller church rather than a large church. And I say this as someone who loves megachurch pastors and large churches that do good discipleship and stuff. But it's really easy for us, sort of megachurch pastor who's well known, to preach to the world and not only to their congregation, because they know there are so many people listening from out beyond. And you can really benefit from listening to pastors like that. And I think it's great if that's part of the ministry. Lord knows there have been pastors like that throughout church history that have benefited way beyond just the place that they've been local. But what I want to tell smaller, medium and smaller size churches and pastors is no one can preach to your congregation like you can, like focus on, like, you look at your congregation, know your people, and don't preach for the podcast audience. You preach for them. TGC asked me a few years ago when I was teaching pastor at our church if they could start putting some of my sermons online and on the TGC preaching podcast. And I told them no, not because I was embarrassed by anything but I was just like, I'm just afraid if I know that some of my sermons are going to get put on that TGC podcast, I'm going to preach different. Like, I'm going to be I'll be preparing sermons with a little bit of a thought of, well, people way beyond the congregation. And I wasn't called to do that. Now, I'm not saying those that do, you guys are, I don't want anyone to hear me saying it's wrong to do that. I just knew that would affect the way I'm preaching. And so I think I think the medium and smaller churches have an opportunity here to actually do like more targeted discipleship through preaching and teaching and worship and whatnot, because people know each other and they're in close community with each other. And that can be a really beautiful thing that we shouldn't lose sight of.
To shift in more towards social media, you mentioned, or in Chris Bale's book, he talked about the importance of moderates to remain in social media to counteract the extremist influence. So do you have thoughts about our responsibility to remain in that square, or do you think it is simply more prone to distract us from the real people in front of us? So obviously this is a question more about wisdom, but also the real challenge many Christians feel of, do I try to mediate the presence, or is it better for me to Benedict option this thing and just get out of here?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this. I really do. And I think the answer of this is going to be different for different people. I mean, just this week, I was talking with a friend. I was really discouraged about some things that were happening on social media and some comments I'd gotten, but then some other things that were going on. And my friend was just like, "Hey, you're letting this into your head. Like, you gotta like, this is taking up too much of your mental and emotional bandwidth. You need to get off line and not like, like you need to kind of stop tuning in on that for a while." And I mean, I think we need friends who will tell us, "Hey, you're misreading this. You're seeing all of this, and you're thinking it's getting way more into your headspace than it actually needs to." So, like, I do feel called, at least at some level, to be in one of the worst spaces, I think, which is Twitter. But the way I do that is, for me, is I schedule posts out and links to articles and things generally. And I'm trying not to tweet sporadically. And I put the time limit thing on my phone so that I don't have the app. I just have the through Safari or whatever to be able to get on it. But for me, that's just because I just don't want to live there. And I've seen people that I've really respected and trusted over the years. I've seen people that live in that space, or they either spend too much time in that space, or they live there so much that it really does kind of change them over time. And I think that's something we got to watch out for. So I wouldn't want to tell everyone in here, and to be moderate sounds all squishy to me. But what Chris Bale means is basically, what he's saying is, he's not using moderate as like you don't have strong convictions. He's saying the moderates are like the people online. I think it's like 80% of tweets are sent out by like 10% of the people on Twitter. So basically, Twitter is run by the people that are like, or the people that are most vocal are the ones that are like, that's their life. They're like constantly vocal, living there all the time, whatnot. And then everybody else is kind of quiet and seeing the train wreck and can't turn their head away, is what it feels like to me. And so when he says the moderates, he's talking about people that are reasonable, that are thoughtful, that are kind, that are they may pipe up with an opinion, and then they either get completely smacked down, or they get all sorts of, trollish behavior toward them, whatever. And then they just opt out, or they get so discouraged, they don't do it again. Or then they're just like, this isn't worth anything. And they get quiet and they watch, but they don't really participate. I don't know that if all of those people spoke up, would it be a different experience? Probably, but I wouldn't want to tell people what I think that is the answer to that, because I think we've got to do the diagnostic check on our own heart here to see, like we've really got to look inside and see like what we're built for, what we're made for, and probably need to have some people around us that can tell us, hey, this is affecting you negatively. You're I mean, I had a realization back at, I mean, this has been 10 years ago now, but back in the day, the old days, Rachel Held Evans and I had like a Twitter debate where I kind of pushed back and she pushed back, and we kind of going back and forth. And she's since she's deceased now, but some of you know she's well known, like kind of progressive evangelical writer and author and whatnot. So we were having this debate back and forth on a Sunday afternoon, and it was like all of her followers and all of my followers, it was like they were like cheering us on like we were in a coliseum, like duking it out. And like no one was convincing anyone of anything. It was just like her fans and my fans, just all like watching us go at it, trying to like, wrestle through this. And afterwards I was just like, okay, I'm done. I'm never going to do that again. And one, because we had corresponded direct messages and the tone is very different than when we're doing that in public, number one. And number two, I was like, this isn't convincing anyone. This is like a spectacle for people to watch. So I made a commitment then. I was like, I will rarely go beyond one or two responses on a Twitter thread to anything. And it's not because I don't, because I think of myself like above that. For me, it was just, I can't, to get beyond that it's self-defeating. It's not really leading to change of minds anywhere. And I just didn't want to be part of the spectacle anymore. So I think, I think we'll have to like feel our way to good places. For me, that was, I had to do that to guard my heart, because I didn't want to become what I'd seen other people become on Twitter. So anyway, that's probably more than you guys care about social media strategy, but just be thinking about like where God's placed you and like how, the influence he's given you and how to use that for good.
Well, this will be our last question for the cohort here, but it continues on this thread of social media. Actually, as I was reading this question, I received a text from a friend who was talking about the way that TikTok, between he and his wife, is leading to anxiety in different paths. The question is, you mentioned that social media algorithms seek to divide or even invoke disgust among users rather than feelings of happiness or hope. Can you expand on this idea? And do you mean to say that human desires or / nature forces the technology to go down this path based on user interaction, likes, etc.? And this is kind of playing on a little bit of the Social Dilemma documentary that you had mentioned, which I would highly recommend to anyone.
Yeah, no, the social media game is marketing, and you don't pay for it because you're the product. Like the reason it's free is because it's your data that they want. That's what you're giving them. So that's the reason it's free. It's because you're not getting a product from them. You are the product for them, the people they want to market and advertise to. And so the algorithms are designed to be able to find out about you, to be able to market to you and to advertise stuff to you, but they're also designed to keep you on the platform as long as possible. And the way that the reason the algorithms work the way they do, it's not because the algorithms are designed, to just help you see things that are going to make you upset. It's because the algorithms are designed in such a way to get a strong reaction from you. And anger and disgust is a much better reaction to keep you on the platform than joy and happiness and fulfillment. So that's the whole game. Like it's not that, and it can give you a warped impression of the world, because you'll just see these things popping up and you'll just think this is happening everywhere. And it's like, no, you're getting served up this because this is the way Twitter and Facebook and to some extent Instagram work. TikTok is a little bit different because it's more entertainment focused, and the kinds of things you click on and you watch, or it starts to, that algorithm gets really good at knowing how to keep you on the app. I don't have TikTok. I just have read enough about it and heard enough about it. The government's probably going to ban it anyway, so I don't have any plans on getting it. But I don't think we like China surveilling us on TikTok. We'd prefer they stick to balloons, I suppose. I don't know, but but the TikTok thing is really a what the disgust and anger is an emotion that will keep you engaged longer. That's why you see more of that online. It's not because it's necessarily bigger, but that's because, and then but there are people that know that's how they get attention and can build their platform and brand. There are people that say crazy things online that they would not say in person because that's the game. That's how you get a lot of likes and retweets about, So, I mean, I have people treat me certain ways online that I know them in person, and I'm just like, I mean, I don't know. Like, but I get it. It's the way it's the gamification of social media. So it's something to be aware of as you think through these things.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Trevin, for all that you've given us over the last few weeks. So much to think about and to meditate on. And again, if you guys are at TGC conference in September, we'd love to be able to meet up with you guys and to be able to talk and meet in person. And then again, you can be expecting the recap email and everything else. But thank you again, Trevin. If you have any questions or anything, you can email us at the Keller Center, reach out to Michael Graham. But if not, it was so good having all of you. Thank you all for your participation and interactions. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. It means a lot that you guys have joined us these last few weeks. I've enjoyed seeing some of the same names and faces. So hopefully we'll be able to meet in person at some point in the future.